Audio.etc. is proudly supported by Auto Sound and Security. Hey guys, how's it going? James here from Audio.etc. Today I am showing you guys how to wire up a pre-existing Japanese factory or not reversing camera into an aftermarket stereo. So we've got here a 2012 Toyota Hiace, and it came with this, it came with this Japanese stereo in it, because obviously it's Japanese import, this big ugly thing here, and a reversing camera. Actually, I shouldn't say ugly, Grant's actually pointing out it's one of the nicer looking ones that we've seen come in. And there is the reversing camera mounted in the factory location on the back, just above the number plate. So the reason I'm kind of making this video is because with pretty much every single case of this sort of setup where there's been a stereo with a Japanese camera in, I'm not sure this is the case with other regions of camera, but with all the ones we deal with, Japanese, it's never just a straight plug and play situation. You have to do wiring and testing and all sorts of stuff to get that existing camera working on your new stereo, which is what I'm doing here. I'm installing a customer's JVC stereo, and this is usually what you're greeted with on the back of the stereo, just a million different plastic plugs. Fortunately, this one has been quite nice to me and only had a few sort of plugs in the dash, but literally I've taken stereos out of cars where every single one of those plugs has been there, and you're like, what on earth is the camera plug? How do I wire up to it? All of that. So that's what I want to kind of show you guys how to do today. Unfortunately, I can't plug that stereo back in and show you it working again now, because as I've just realized, now that it's all unplugged, it needs a password to get back into it because it's from the 90s and dumb. So I can't just plug that back in and show you it working, but I can show you the methods to which, how I figure out what wires are the signal wires, what wires are the power wires, what kind of voltage it needs to run, and how to wire up to it. So the first step in the process is working out what plugs do what, and essentially which ones you need for when you're going to be installing the new stereo. So if you've got like one of these with just a whole bunch of plastic plugs, then what you do essentially is you slowly unplug them, like one at a time, figuring out which one stops certain functions from working. Only thing you don't want to unplug is the main power harness. That should usually be pretty easy to tell what that is. It's usually the biggest one in the car and it's the most factory looking. You can figure out how to, define the main power harness just by testing for the permanent power supply in it, but that's something else. So as long as you know where your main power harness is, don't unplug that. The main reason is because if you do unplug it and it's a situation like this where the stereo is security coded, then you're not going to be able to plug it back in and continue testing. So don't unplug that one, but everything else you can just slowly unplug. So you do that one at a time until, so luckily for me, I didn't have too many to have to unplug. There's obviously just the main power harness here. There's this little one with 4 pins in it, and there's this one here. So what I found was the first thing you want to do is put the car onto ignition, put the gear in reverse. You don't have to start the car, just put it to ignition and put the gear shifter into reverse so that the camera shows up on the screen. And then you want to slowly start unplugging these, and there's a couple of things to watch for. So if you unplug a cable, and if you unplug a plug and the stereo goes back to radio mode or whatever it was you're on before, chances are what you've unplugged there contains the reverse trigger wire. And then you can start testing for that with the multimeter. You can use a test lamp, but I would highly recommend using a multimeter just so you don't accidentally trip any sensors or anything like that, because sometimes speed pulse is in the same plug. So I found that by unplugging this plug, it went back to radio and stopped displaying the reverse camera. And then I found in this little, was it a 5-pin loom, this wire on the right here, this purple one, or is it blue? I can't tell, I'm colorblind. That's always good when electricians are colorblind, eh? This one on the right had the reverse trigger in it, so it shows up 12 volts when you go into reverse and shows up nothing when you're out of reverse. So that's my reverse trigger wire. I can set that aside knowing that I need that. The next thing to watch for is if you unplug a plug and it doesn't go out of reverse camera mode, but the image goes away, like it just goes black. Chances are what you've unplugged there contains the signal and or the power supply for the camera, which is what I found when I unplugged this little 4-pin cable. Now I have done lots of these Toyotas, so I actually know just by looking at it that this is the camera cable, but in the event of you working on a car where you don't know what you're dealing with, if you're just an amateur, or it's your car and you aren't an electrician, unplugging a cable with the signal in it or the power for the camera will make the image go black. Once you've found that, something you can start doing then is testing those wires with the multimeter, and you should find at least one of the wires has some kind of voltage on it, somewhere between 6 volts and 12 volts, and that's likely to be the power supply wire for the camera. So I've found cameras that run off 4 volts, 6 volts, 8 volts, 10 volts and 12 volts. Often the 10 volt ones you can get away with just running straight 12 volts onto them, but you can do what you want with that. So in this plug, I already know this because I've done these before, but if I did test this with a multimeter, I would find that the red wire here, it's going to be hard to focus, but there is a black, a white, a red and a yellow. They're very thin. The red one on here is the power wire, and when it's still plugged into the stereo, you'll find that there are 6 volts running down to it. Because typically the Japanese stereos actually power their cameras themselves. They don't power off accessory or anything, they just power it straight from the stereo, and that red wire would be receiving 6 volts. So what we know now is that for wiring up it to the new stereo, we need to somehow put 6 volts down that red wire, or 8 volts, or whatever it is that you've found. The next thing you can do is start testing for the signal wire. Now there is no real good way to do this. If you have one of those fancy screen testing devices with probes, you can use that to maybe find the image. But one way I found actually works quite well. Now I'm not sure if this is the case with NTSC, but if it's a PAL camera, which most of the ones that we deal with are, I've found that if I have my test lamp on ground and I probe the signal wire with my test lamp, what tends to happen is the image will flicker and go a bit staticky, because what you're doing is essentially grounding or shorting out the video signal. It doesn't damage the camera, but it just kind of interferes with it a wee bit. And if you can probe that like on and off and you notice the image is going all funny, chances are you found the video signal. And then for me in this one, we've got 2 remaining wires which are black and white, and they're thicker than the other 2. Now I know for a fact that these 2 black and white wires actually just go straight back to 1 core inside of this loom here, but usually if it's got 4 cores, you'll have one which is the shield for the video signal and one which is the ground. The shield and the ground are essentially the same thing. Sometimes their cameras have it separated, sometimes they, share it. It's like a common ground sort of thing. They use the ground or the negative power supply to shield the video signal from interference. And you can find that by using a multimeter on continuity mode, by putting one of the probes to the chassis of the car, putting it on the mode where if you make a circuit it beeps, and then testing the wires. And if you get like a nice solid beep and there is very little resistance on it, chances are you have found the shield. Sorry, I should have explained this a bit better. You want to do this testing while it is plugged into the stereo. So you leave this plug plugged into the stereo with it on reverse mode showing the image, and you test these wires while it is plugged in and turned on. That's how you find the 6 volts coming out of the stereo to power the camera. That's how you find the signal wire, by probing it and making the image change or go flickery. And that's how you find the ground wires, because these wires aren't going to be grounded at the other end. These wires are going to be floating in free air if you've got it unplugged. So you test all these while it's in the stereo. And once you've done all that, you've pretty much found your wires. Maybe later on I'll try and make a more in-depth video about how to do this, because I was going to show you guys literally the method, but I tried to plug that stereo back in and it's locked out now, unfortunately. So maybe another day I'll, when I've got a similar job, I'll show you the actual method that I go by to find what wires do what. But now that we've found our wires, the next step is to solder some connections onto them and work out how we're going to do the power supply. So obviously the yellow one, and for me it doesn't really matter whether I use black or white because they're both the same core, they're just split into 2 wires for some reason. I just need to put the shield of an RCA head to the white and the core of an RCA head to yellow, because that's my signal. And then red is my power, and black is going to be my negative power supply, even though it's shield. So I need to put power down there. So soldering an RCA head on, I'll show you guys, but I don't need to explain it. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just need to solder an RCA head on. But I'm going to show you how we do the power supplies for these cameras, because I've seen other people use straight 12 volt to 6 volt reducers. That's totally fine, you can use those. We use a regulated voltage reducer, which is adjustable, because we come across cameras that run on all sorts of different voltages. So we've got this thing here. It's from our supplier, It's called a cam volt. I'm sure you can get these online off the internet somewhere. I'm sorry I don't have a link for them, but I'll show you what they look like, and if you see them again, it will no doubt be the same thing, because many of our suppliers get these, and they're all exactly the same, so they're just buying them from China somewhere probably. So it does come with a little set of instructions, depending on where you get it from. Ours come from Ed's, so they do come with instructions. Piece of heat shrink to cover it all up when you're done. It's packaged in a nice little anti-static bag, but we're going to rip this open. So what we got here is a little circuit board. I'm going to try, I need to sit down so I can see what the camera is seeing. Okay, so you guys might be able to read it says out positive and out negative on that side. And then on this side, it says in negative and in positive. So this is the voltage input side where we're going to put our 12 volts input from the car. And this is our output side, which is going to power the camera. All of this crap, I don't really know what it is. But what we've got here, this little blue box, and on top of it, that is, I've lost my screwdriver now. On top of this blue box, there's a little flathead screw here, and this is infinitely variable. It doesn't have like a top and a bottom. It can spin as many times as you want, because what this is a digital voltage regulator, as opposed to an analog one where you are simply changing the resistance. So this is actually digitally regulating it rather than analogly. And it's a nice wee compact little doodacky. I'm going to show you how we wire it up. So what I'm going to do here, just got a nice thing for this to sit on. I've got a power supply over here which puts out 13.8 volts. It doesn't really matter what the input side of the regulator receives, because it's going to put out the same amount no matter what, unless the input is less than the output. So whether it's a 12 volt, 14 volt, 10 volt, you know, whatever the input side is, it can put out any amount less than that. So this is 13.8 volts. We're going to just clip the negative onto the negative input really carefully, and clip the positive onto the positive input really carefully. Okay, there we go. So you can see I've got my input going to the input side of it, and the little red LED is lit up to let you know that it's on. The next thing we want to do is get, my test lamp and the multimeter. Now ideally what you want to do is, if you've got them, use multimeters with crocodile clips as opposed to probes, because these are just a lot easier. I'm going to hook the negative to the negative output, and the positive to the positive output. Turn it on to voltage mode, voltage DC, and at the moment it's showing 12.85 volts out. The next thing I'm going to do is put my test lamp on. And the reason we put the test lamp in line with it is because it creates a load on the system, and often with voltage regulators or even unregulated ones, as soon as you put a load on it of any kind, it does drop a tiny bit, and we just like to do this to make sure it's dead accurate. All you have to do is clip it from positive side to the negative side out, just like that, so you can see my test lamp is glowing there. Now what I'm going to do, let's see if I can get this to be in focus, 12.59 volts. So I'm going to get my flat blade screwdriver, put it on the little flathead turny bit on top of the blue thing, and just slowly start turning this. Let me just show you what this all looks like at the first. So you can see we've got the input side, the output side, negative and positive, and then my test lamp is just going from there to there, and it's glowing just to put a load on it. Okay, so now what we do is we start turning anti-clockwise for down, and you'll see that the voltage is starting to go down. And it doesn't really matter how fast you turn it, because it's digital, it's very, very accurate. You can do it to 0.01 of a volt accurately. And it does take a while to get out of the 12 volt range, but once you do, it starts to drop a bit quicker. So I'm just going to turn it a bit faster here. There we go, we're out of 12 volts. 10.949876. Now what I like to do is run them at just slightly higher than 6 volts. So I run these 6 volt cameras at about 6.1 volts. Just a tiny nudge forward. There we go, 6.10. So I just turn this enough times to the point where it shows 6.1 volts, and we know that it is going to be 6.1 volts once we've got the camera on it, because we're using the test lamp as like a load. So if I take the test lamp off, it goes up 0.01 of a volt, but the point is, like, different cameras are going to have different loads that they put on them, so it's good to simulate a load if you can. And now that that is set, we can solder some wires onto it. So I already have the loom for the stereo already made up, connected to a hookup lead, and when I know I'm doing a camera, I pre-wire in a little red and black wire coming out of it, which is hooked to ground and accessory. And now I can solder these wires to the input side of the camera, of the voltage regulator, because that's going to be the supply for it. And then what I do after that is solder some more of this to the output side, which can then be soldered onto the camera wires. So that's what I'm going to do now. Do not get in and out mixed up. Just going to offer you that little piece of advice. And don't get positive and negative mixed up, Grant? Don't ever put positive to negative and negative to positive, unless you're running 2 speakers in series. So this is my input side here. Here's my loom. I'm going to cut it off about there with my cutters. And I like to just strip off a tiny bit of insulation, just like that. Turn it upside down, and it's good because it does have the labeling on the bottom side as well. But look, there's an arrow to tell you what way voltage goes so you don't get them mixed up. Okay, now what I like to do is poke the wires through from the top, one at a time. Sometimes it helps just to twist them a tiny bit. Poke the positive through. Oh, sorry, my hand is completely in the way. It's good if you can get them both poked through at the same time. Positive, negative. Okay, we've got those through. Just gently sit there, get my solder. Now get our soldering on and just very lightly touch them on the circuit board. There we go. Don't put too much heat on this, obviously, it is a circuit board. There we go. So that's the input side done. And if there's a bit too much sticking up, we can just snip it. Red through, oh man, I'm shaking. Red through the positive, black through the negative, and get it as far into the hole as possible. Now just, there we go. Now what we've got, as you can see, is the wires sort of, they jump in like that, which is going to be good for when we heat shrink it, because it's all going to come out of the middle. And on the bottom we got nice little, there we go, nice little solder connections. So now what we can do is we can take our, tuned and soldered board and our piece of little heat shrink, put the heat shrink over it, heat it up with the heat gun and cover that up nicely. Just sort of pinch this to get it over. It like just fits, there we go. There we go. Got our heat gun, got our piece of heat shrink over it. There we go. Just turn it over, make sure we get the bottom side, because sometimes it doesn't heat the whole thing up. There we go. Now we've got this nicely shrunk little package thing, and you can even see the little dial there sticking through if you need to do a little bit of later adjustment. Afterwards, it's not too hard just to break that with a little blade and then twist it a bit more with a screwdriver. So there we go. Oh, and by the way, there's my reverse lead wire that I already pre-wired in and extended out. So now this can go in the car. Okay, so plug this into here. Cool. Now this red and black wire are going to solder onto here, this camera wire. But I've got all this excess that I don't want to have, so instead of doing it up at this end, I'm going to do it down at this end where it, is way more convenient. Still going to cut it out nice and long though. And you guys will see what I mean now by me saying that it's not 4 cores, it's actually just 3 cores with the shield split into 2. There we go, get the paper off. And then what we find is that if you separate it, it's actually the red wire here, sorry, it's going to be hard to see. You can see it's actually the red wire with the shield all twisted around the yellow, because that's the shield for the signal. If we just separate that all out, twist the shield back around itself so that's a nice little thing we can solder to. And then now we've got our red, yellow and negative, or shield. Splice these off a wee bit. Cool. Okay. So I've got myself an RCA here. This is actually just a red RCA with a piece of yellow heat shrink over it, because we run out of yellow ones very quickly, so we just use spare red ones and white ones and everything, and then put yellow heat shrink over them so that they're obviously for video. So what I can do is I'm actually going to, since they're both going to be connected to the same thing, I'm going to get the shield of my RCA and the negative of my power output from my little reducer. I'm going to twist them together, because they're both going to solder to the same wire anyway, just like that. And let's put some solder on them just so that they stay together. There we go. And while we're at it, tin up the rest of the wires on that one. And let's tin up the wires on the car end, signal, power, and shield. Next thing I'm going to do before I solder anything together is I've got some heat shrink that I'm going to put on first. So I'm just going to put this big long bit of black over the top of the camera wire, push it back there so it doesn't shrink preemptively. And now I've got two little bits of yellow, which are going to go on the signal and power wires. So now we can start soldering some things together. Hold that with one hand. Now first steps first, let's do the signal of the RCA, which is going to be the yellow wire. There we go. Really takes like no time for the solder to melt and re-harden. Slip the heat shrink over it and shrink the heat shrink. Some people call it shrink tube, we call it heat shrink. Doesn't really make a difference what you call it. Does the same thing. Since it's so small, I can just like heat it up with the barrel of my soldering iron. And now the power red wire goes to the power output of our little reducer. Solder them together. Heat shrink over that. And now the shield. So now that's the first stage done. So you can see there, I've got the yellow wire for the signal going to the RCA head, the red wire going to the power output from my little voltage reducer, and then the shields all twisted and soldered together. And now we can slip the big black bit of heat shrink over top of all of this. Force them to live together, even if they don't want to. Oh, maybe I should have got a slightly bigger piece of heat shrink, but I think we'll be okay. There we go. Cool. There we go, that's on. Shrink that up. Also works with the soldering iron barrel. Just got to sort of work your way down it. There we go. And that's pretty much it. That's the hard part really done. So what we got now is our lead coming from the car. Comes out into a nicely done up piece of heat shrink. We've got an RCA lead coming out, as well as power leads which go to our voltage reducer, which goes back to accessory. So the camera's going to turn on with accessory. And now we just need to do a wee bit more tidying of the loom so that this isn't all dangling loose, and wire up our reverse trigger lead for the stereo to the wire that we found before to be this one here, which is the reverse light trigger. Wire that to there and then get the stereo in. So that's pretty much the hard part. I'll come back to you guys when I'm putting the stereo in. Okay guys, ready to put the stereo in. So JVC, what's the model number? KW-M730BT CarPlay model. By the way, we didn't sell this. We're not a carrier or advocate of JVC. The customer has supplied it themselves, so we said, okay, we'll chuck it in. I'm just gonna quickly loom up some of these things sticking off the back of the stereo so they're not dangling everywhere. Okay. And I've taken the cap off the camera input and not the video output, so I know which one to plug the camera into. Cool, so we've got our main harness, then we've got our camera, our microphone remote, and our GPS aerial all in one loom, and then the two USBs over here, and they are cable tied up in there, so they're not going to be yanked on at all. So we can start plugging some things in. First of all, let's do the USBs. I'm assuming that you put the black USB to the black USB and the grey USB to the grey USB. That would make a bit of sense, wouldn't it? And what we're going to do is put some tape around both of them to kind of lock them in, like that. That's one. Whoops, that one didn't work. Cool. And now let's just tape those together nicely as well. And I know some of you are probably thinking, man, all this stuff's going to rattle in the dash. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, if you want to do any anti-rattling stuff, you can wrap all of this in Tessa tape, you can wrap it in foam, whatever you want, or carpet, whatever you want to do. We don't tend to do that much sort of stuff because we don't have that much of a problem with that. I don't mean we don't have a problem with rattles, I mean like we don't really get that bad of rattles to justify any of that sort of stuff. Where's the aerial? That needs to be plugged in. That's sitting down here before we forget it. I always forget the aerial because it like falls down the gap and then you think, oh yep, that's everything plugged in. Anyway, let's plug in the GPS aerial. Click. Plug in the microphone, which goes in that hole. And the RCA cable for the camera goes into this one. And I'm also going to tape these together. And now the main harness, which that is upside down, needs to go this way. Now that, oh wait, and the aerial, one last thing to plug in. The aerial before I forget. And on this one, it's on a fly lead, fortunately, because it's short. Cool, and now the fun part of trying to get this all back in. One thing I hate about these hi-S's is right down here where the cavity for the stereo is, this drawer like moves in and out and actually is like right in the way of where all the wires go. So if you pull out like this, some wires can fall down, then you go to try put it back in and it stops halfway because it hits on all the wires. I've seen that a lot with Japanese systems where there's like heaps and heaps of loom. So if you can, try and avoid that drawer if you're doing one of these hi-aces, and put it all in while the drawer is closed, not open. There we go, it's all the way in. Now let's reach over and find the key barrel. There it is. Oops, that's JVC Kenwood Corporation. That's interesting. I didn't know that they were the same thing. Okay, language, English, yep, that's fine. Clock, it's currently 2:56. We need to choose the correct time zone. Auckland. There we go. Apparently it's going to get the clock from the GPS. Okay. Display, viewing angle. Okay. Oh, well, your head is there and the stereo is on that kind of an angle, so I guess what we're going to do is choose... Oh, I see, it changes the light of it. Wow. That's actually pretty fancy, I have to say. Never seen that before in a stereo. I'm going to say 2. Hey Grant, look at this. Just a weird gimmicky feature of JVC. Camera. Rear camera interruption on, parking guidelines on, guidelines setup. Oh, look at that, there's our view. Well, we know the camera is working. Whoops. You know what, that's actually quite well set up to begin with. We're just going to leave that for now. Back, demo off. We don't need the demo on. Now let's click finish. Cool, there we go. So the question is, if we put it in reverse, we need to be on ignition to begin with. Ignition, turn the window wipers off, go reverse. And there is our camera image. Jeez, those fans are loud. Damn, those are loud fans. Does this have a camera source? Yep. Oh, no, does it not have a camera source? This would be the first modern stereo that I've seen that doesn't have a direct camera source. That's weird. Crazy. Oh yeah. I can see why people are attracted to these things, but personally they put a lot of effort obviously into the color and the user interface and stuff, but I'm still just not a fan of like the quality of the sound and everything else like that. They're cheap for a reason, you know. But I'm really surprised that it doesn't have a camera source. You can only see it if you're in reverse. Camera doesn't give you the option to have it turn on by button. That's one that like Sony, Alpine, Pioneer, they all do it. You can go and see the camera just from home. I guess on this one we just have to be in reverse. And there it is. It works. Well, there we go, guys. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how we wire up our Japanese reversing cameras that are already existing in cars to new stereos which run off 12 volts when the cameras run off things like 6 volts and 8 volts and all that sort of thing. Figure out what wires do what, solder an RCA head onto the signal wires, use one of those voltage, measure what voltage the camera is running on when the original stereo is still in there, set up one of those voltage reducers to put out that signal, wire it into the loom, wire it to the wiring in the car, put it all back together, and it works. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you guys. If there's anything I jumped over or skipped, or you have a question, definitely ask me a question in the comments below. I'm happy to answer them. If you want me to make another video going into a bit more detail about how to figure out what wires do what when testing in the dash, let me know in the comments as well, and maybe next time I get one of these I'll make another brief video on how to do that. Maybe I'll make a video on testing all the wires you could possibly find in a dash and how to figure out what they are. Would that be interesting to you guys? Would you like to see a video on me telling you how to work out what is permanent, accessory, illumination, aerial, power, amplifier, remote power, front left speakers, front right, rear left, rear right, which one is positive and negative? What else can you find? Camera wires, reverse wire, all that sort of stuff. If that's of interest to you guys, if you want me to make a video about that, maybe leave me a comment. Maybe that's something I can do in the future. So, thank you for watching today's video, guys. I hope you have found, some of you have found this helpful. That was generally the idea of it. Yeah. For any of you who are subscribers and are going to catch up with me tomorrow, I have another video for you guys tomorrow. Hopefully it'll just be a one video deal. Tomorrow I am doing, Friday, good old tricky Friday job. I'm installing a Pioneer MVH Pioneer MVH Z5050 BT, CarPlay, stereo, no CD player, into a late model Porsche 997, and it's got a Bose system in it. It's got steering wheel controls. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So if you guys want to see how that turns out, make sure you check in with me tomorrow. And if you're not already, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications button, like my page on Facebook, and support me on Patreon. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. Kite Ano.